This is hell.
England celebrated something called Freedom Day yesterday as the Conservative government decided it was time to celebrate the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is weird because the country is currently facing a massive surge in infections. But in declaring yesterday Freedom Day, what the Conservatives may have accidentally done is revealed the many contradictions and shortcomings of their definition of freedom. Returning This Is Hell to talk freedom, Keir Milburn wrote the Novara Media opinion piece, Freedom Day won't set us free. Populist masterstroke? More like unmitigated disaster. Welcome back to This Is Hell, Keir.
Hi, Chuck. It's really, really nice to be back, actually.
It's great to have you on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation a couple of years ago when we talked about Generation Left on the show, and I'm very, very happy to have you back on, sir. So you write, the government thought that dubbing yesterday, July 19th, the day that England lifts the bulk of its coronavirus legal restrictions, Freedom Day, would be a masterstroke, a populist masterstroke. Unsurprisingly, the decision is already backfiring as the implications of removing the bulk of pandemic-related health measures at a time when only 54% of the country has been fully vaccinated, became abundantly clear. Indeed, by calling it Freedom Day, the Tories have inadvertently shown a light on the contradictions inherent in their specific brand of freedom. To what extent is the Tories' understanding of freedom England's understanding of freedom? How partisan is the concept of freedom in the UK?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I think probably it's probably less widespread than it is in the US, where I think this sort of this conception of freedom, which is sort of freedom, a sort of individualized form of freedom, in which you're free if the government hasn't got a law saying you can't do something, and so you'd be more free the less laws that you're subject to. I think that is much more dominant in the US. I think it's dominant in the UK, but I do think there's more of a social democratic history in the UK. There's more of a sort of collective idea of freedom. That this idea that if freedom is to be meaningful, well, in that case, and we need the sort of infrastructures and the resources in order to be able to exercise that freedom. I think that's sort of more of an undercurrent, but it's a really interesting moment at the minute because you can see those two forms of freedom sort of battling each other, if you know what I mean.
Do you think that just because we have a two-party system that undermines our ability to have this kind of discussion and debate?
Well, to be honest, I mean, the UK looks like a one-party system at the moment. Conservatives just seem never to lose, no matter how incompetent they're like 12 points ahead in the polls at the moment, despite absolute incompetence beyond belief. Between the official figures are something like 153,000 people have died of COVID-related. Have got coronavirus on their death certificate, in that, and if you do excess deaths, which is the death rate has gone up during this period, it's much more. It's into the 200,000s, etc. It just doesn't seem to have impacted on the Conservatives. I think what it is in the US, the Conservative movement is much stronger and is a proper movement, whereas in the UK, that doesn't tend to be the case. There are many, many right-wing actors, but it's not a mass movement, the Conservative movement in the UK, in this a sort of mass ideological movement to the extent it is in the US, I think. And so the sort of the ideology of these freedoms, they're not expressed or codified in the same way as they are in the US. I'd put it that way.
You write that not long after defiantly announcing the decision to open up the country, the Boris Johnson government was forced into some clarifactory backpedaling, announcing its expectation that most mask wearing should in fact remain in place, only now as a matter of personal and corporate choice rather than as a legal restraint. Is the government then abdicating their responsibility when it comes to safety protocols? To what extent did the government tell the British population, you're on your own on Freedom Day?
It's been a very. I was listening to you just recounting a little bit of it, of the history of the last few weeks. And when you hear your country explained to another country, you do feel a little bit embarrassed about just how bizarre the whole thing is. But basically, this day, Freedom Day, it was such a ridiculous name. It was announced, Freedom Day is July the 19th. We're going to remove all of the COVID restrictions. But the problem is we're going through a real spiking in infections. This Delta virus is really infectious and it's really spreading in the UK. It's spreading amongst young people in particular, and of course, their risk of death via COVID is much reduced from older populations who are now tended to be, well, to be honest, the people who are very vulnerable to them, many people in old age care homes, etc. They're the ones who died in very large numbers as the pandemic first emerged. Now older people are vaccinated. In the UK, people are vaccinated. Older people first, down to younger people. So it's mainly younger people who are less vaccinated, and so it's spreading through them. So it's not causing as many deaths. But of course, we now know that there are all sorts of other, this idea of long COVID, that you can have really quite severe symptoms, energy loss, severe reduction in lung capacity, etc. For a long time, whether you're old or whether you're young. So it's really, really spreading, and so. People started pointing out, look, if you remove all the legal restrictions, what's going to happen is that this is going to take off even more. So the government then announced, well, we don't expect there to be less mask wearing or less social distancing. We just think people will do it out of a sense of personal responsibility. So that immediately says to me, well, if nothing changes in our behavior, how is that meaningful freedom? I mean, nothing's happened. It's some sort of metaphysical sort of freedom that doesn't actually influence what we can do. That just seems a contradiction to me. But then what happens is the government then announces people who are clinically vulnerable to COVID, who are going to have more severe restrictions, perhaps people who've got asthma, these sorts of conditions. Well, they're now advising those people to restrict their freedom. So they're saying, please go shopping only during less busy times and not during peak times, etc. So he said, hang on a minute. So what seemed like the removal of legal restrictions actually looks a little bit more like the removal of legal protections from those who need them. And what it does when you look at this sort of example of a particular type of freedom, you realize, in fact, it relies on a whole series of other unfreedoms, because one of the other things that's being removed or pulled down are rights for workers. So if you're clinically vulnerable, you had the opportunity before the expectation was that you would be allowed, if you were able to, you'd be allowed to work from home and therefore decide to remove yourself from interaction and therefore lower your risk, of course. Now that has been removed, and now it's up to your boss whether you can exercise that. Now that, to me, right, that sounds like a removal of the legal protection to decide you're on your own exposure to risk. The government so this freedom depends on how you look at it, Chuck. Is it the removal of legal restrictions? Is it the removal of legal protections? It's looking a lot more like the second, to be honest.
So how much more are, what we were in the States calling, I'm sure you were in England as well, how much more are so-called essential workers in danger due to Freedom Day?
Well, so this is the other angle. You've got essential workers who are working on transport, or who are working in sort of retail, etc. They're now saying, well, now, so before Freedom Day, hooray, Freedom Day, before Freedom Day, you had to wear a mask in a sort of public space, such as on public transport or in a shop, unless you had a medical exemption. And, it wasn't the medical exemptions weren't checked on in particular, but basically the majority of people wore masks. And if people were not wearing a mask and it looked like it was dangerous behavior, you could, ask them to leave the shop. Now it's illegal to ask them to leave the shop. So once again, these workers have lost their legal protections, the legal protections which are allowing them to control the level of risk they were exposed to. I think that's one of the contradictions, I think, that gets exposed by this. And in fact, so mask wearing and social distance is a really useful. In a way, the COVID pandemic has really exposed the restrictions, the limitations of this sort of idea of individualized freedom. So the reason government brought in this idea that it's up to individuals and companies as well to decide on mask wearing or social distancing. The reason they brought that in was to say, well, look, this is the argument. It's not a very good argument, but this is it. People are the ones who should be able to decide on the level of risk, the exposure to risk. So if somebody doesn't want to wear a mask, they can decide to expose themselves to more risk, and it's their personal choice. But the point is, of course, that's not true. because when we wear a mask, we partly wear a mask to protect ourselves, but we mainly wear a mask to protect other people. So that if we cough, we have an asymptomatic, we don't know we've got the virus, and we cough, well, the virus gets caught in our mask and it doesn't spread to other people. And so, what seems like a decision around personal risk is actually a decision about other people's risk, right? And so that's one of the interesting things about COVID is that it undermines this idea that that we are autonomous individuals who can make decisions that don't impact on other people. If you look at mask wearing, of course it does impact. What we decide there will impact on everybody else, right? So it's not, if you want to, you can't just make it that decision as an individual person. That's something that has to be negotiated between everybody. And the ideal way to do that negotiation about how we interact with each other, is through democracy, democratic negotiation, if you will, which is why where we start to see perhaps another idea of freedom, what we call democratic freedom. In fact, I'm taking that term from a book by Annalene de Gin, who I think you had on your show, actually, who's written a really great book called Freedom and Unruly History, in which she says, she's going back to ancient Greece, and looking at the conception of freedom that was in ancient Athens, for instance, and she says, look, when we look back at like 2,500 years of history of thinking about freedom, you can sort of see two different models about what freedom means. And she says the conception of freedom with the longest history you would call democratic freedom. It's that, it's the idea, it's not the idea that we are freer the less government interferes with us. It is, we are free if we have control over how we are governed or how we govern ourselves, right? So it's a conception of freedom in which you're trying to maximize the ability for people to determine what they do in their lives, but you can only do that one of two ways: either by acting as an individual or by acting democratically and negotiating the course of our lives, removing restrictions from those, but in a democratic way, if you know what I mean.
So what was the intent of Freedom Day? Were they just trying to score political points for the Tories, maybe with their base? And did it work?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So yes, it was meant as a sort of Freedom Day is quite it's quite a ridiculous term, and it was meant as this populist sort of something to throw to their supporters. At last, we've got freedom back. I mean, who doesn't want that? When you look into it a little bit more, the timing of it is more to do with Boris Johnson's internal management of his own party, the Conservative Party, where you have different wings in the Conservative Party, and he thought that he'd have a rebellion amongst his MPs if he tried to delay the removal of restrictions, which is what he was getting the medical advice for. Look, we're going through a spike of COVID infections. There's only 54% of the population who are vaccinated. You leave it 3 months or a couple of months, 2-3 months, that vaccination rate will be up. Therefore, infection rates will probably be down. It's a more sensible time to do that. He couldn't do that. He couldn't follow the data. He had to follow the date, which was set by his internal rebellions from inside the Conservative Party, and has it worked? I think it's backfired. I think that basically people can sort of see the politics in the decision, if you know what I mean. The politics, the sort of messy politics behind this big shiny word called freedom, if you know what I mean.
So to what extent does freedom, this individualistic freedom from other people, undermine the freedom to work together collectively? What is the impact of this kind of individual freedom on any sense of community? Because, any collective or group has more power than any individual, unless, of course, that individual is a billionaire. So you would think that you would want to go with the group that gives you more power. So what is the impact of this kind of individual freedom on any sense of community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the reason that individual freedom seems attractive is because that's the way our society is set up. All the institutions are all sort of based around that, But one way to think about how this individualized sense of freedom interrupts a more collective sense of freedom is because that sense of individual freedom, it's always based on hiding how your sense of individual autonomous freedom relies on the unfreedom of other people to pick up the cost, if you like. So like, let's set up an image of a CEO of a company who feels like an autonomous person. I can get all these things done and other people can't get these things done. That's because I'm a really free person, etc. Sort of Ayn Rand sort of figure, if you want. Basically they can do those things. They have that element of freedom because they have the resources to do it, because that all these infrastructures are set up to enable their action, but also just on a day-to-day level, they can do that because somebody else is doing their washing and tidying their house and cooking their meals. All of those things we have to do, which can be pleasant but are quite often chores, let's be honest. Well, if you get somebody else to do them, then you feel an increase in your freedom. But of course, for that person, it's a reduction on their freedom. They have to go to work and do those things, etc. Of course, it's the same with our cars and our consumer goods. Of course, the freedom we feel when we drive down the road in our car, that is bought at the cost of the unfreedom of the person who has to go to work and do these things. Of course, they need the money, right? But that just brings up, economic constraints, the way that our lives are channeled in certain directions because of the economic constraints in this. If you've got the money, you're not subject to those economic constraints. So this idea of a sovereign individual who's autonomous from everybody else and makes their own mind up, makes their own personal choices, it doesn't affect anyone else, it doesn't depend on anybody else, that has always been a myth. It's always been a myth. And so what we're seeing at the moment with COVID, but I think climate change works in the same way. They're both. In fact, there's a recent book by Benjamin Bratton is called The Revenge of the Real. And he says, like, climate change and COVID is this revenge of reality, puncturing these illusions, puncturing these myths that we've built up. And one of those is that we are autonomous individuals who are not interdependent on anybody else. And so what COVID does, it shows that we are interdependent, that our actions impact on others. And in fact, other people's actions impact on us. It's the same with climate change. And when, we realize that, when we drive down the road in our car and feel free, well, those actions are actually impacting other people through carbon emissions going into the atmosphere, climate change developing, and therefore, extreme weather events being more common. I mean, we've seen it in the Pacific Northwest. There's been incredible floods in Germany last week. This is climate change. It's happening now, and it's causing huge disruption. If you ask people in the Pacific Northwest when those heat waves and forest fires were going on, how free they felt, they didn't feel very free at all. But these things are related, So it's almost like reality is coming back, and it's puncturing all of these myths, the myths that sustain this individualized conception of freedom.
One of those myths that I was thinking about while you were responding to the question is this idea of the self-made millionaire. How important is that concept of the self-made millionaire to this idea of individualistic freedom? Because we know that nobody can be a self-made millionaire unless they're living in a vacuum by themselves, and you can't make $1 million that way.
Yeah, but if you lived in that vacuum, $1 million would be of no use to you.
Exactly.
It's only a use for mediating relations with others. Yeah. I mean, how do people make money? That could lead us onto another area, actually, because so one of the other things that has happened during the pandemic, of course, right? One of the things, the phenomenon we're finding, I think it's true in the UK and in the US, is that employers who are paying very low wages are finding it really hard to fill positions, and that's because in the US, people have got their checks for $1,400, right? Which has taken a lot of the economic pressure off people, and so they'll be able to make some different choices. It's the same in the UK, where for many people they were furloughed so that they could stay at home and not work. If they say you were an electrician, etc., you had to go to other people's houses. That wasn't permitted, so the government would pay a proportion of your wage. And people found that found it very annoying, I'm sure, but also found it as a certain moment of freedom, if you like, right? It sort of reveals the economic compulsion, the way that, when the decisions we make about our lives are dependent on all these other things, economic compulsion, all these sorts of things. And then, what's held up at the top of that is this idea of self-made millionaires, millionaires or the rich as the wealth creators, right? Well, that's not true. They're the wealth skimmers, if you like, right? The wealth is, the people who go to work that produces the wealth. That wealth is skimmed off, etc. And that's become more and more obvious because more and more wealth is created via the extraction of rents of various kinds rather than investing in production where workers produce things, etc. You get economic growth that way. Instead, the economy is moving much more towards various kinds of extracting rents from buildings, of course, rents from, when we use Facebook, etc. They extract rents from us in the form of data, which they then sell on to advertisers, these sorts of things. So in a way, capitalism is getting more and more sort of parasitic in a way, and it's leading to really big declining growth rates if you compare it to sort of the post-war years, etc., which is one of these other big problems that capitalism is facing in our era of multiple crises.
This individual freedom with fewer laws and absent government control would suggest it is the opposite of what are called law and order politics. So one would think that this kind of individual freedom would be antithetical to the far right, as it suggests what they claim anarchism is, and that is a lack of laws and government. So how contradictory is the conservative view of freedom as individual rights, absent government and laws, to the conservative view on the police and policing, which they claim is support for law and order?
Yeah, it sounds like a contradiction, isn't it? Really? Yeah. But when you look into it, I don't think it is, because in a way, what the right wants laws to do is to enable them and restrict others, right? So the law, it should be used to enable them to do what they want, but it should be applied on others to prevent them from doing what they want. And so you see this in the movement for Black Lives is something that really raised this about how people's experiences of policing is so different depending on their background, depending on their race, depending on their wealth, etc., etc. So many people's experience of the police is of the law restricting them, interfering with their lives. So one of the things which the present moment has really stripped away is that this individualized idea of freedom, it was always only supposed to apply to some people and not be a universal application. The movement for Black Lives in some ways is just a demand that freedom should apply to everybody, that everybody should be subjected to the same sorts of policing or removal of that policing, if you want to look at it that way. So although it seems contradictory, it's not. It's like, yes, we want harsh laws. We want harsh laws to apply, but not to us, to apply to them.
How much are the basic tenets of neoliberalism under threat due to the pandemic? Because here in the States, the media and government want us to get vaccinated and rush back to the normal of neoliberalism and, for example, burning as much fossil fuel as possible by traveling now that the pandemic is supposedly over for the fully vaccinated, and get on with our holiday season. So is neoliberalism under threat? Or more so, is everyone excited about returning to neoliberalism as soon as possible?
Well, people are excited about getting... I mean, the thing is, Chuck, I'd absolutely love a Freedom Day, a meaningful Freedom Day. There's nothing I'd like better than to go to a really good gig or to go dancing with a load of people. I'd absolutely love to do that. And I want, we need to get to that position. But the problem is when you have a fake Freedom Day, what's going to happen is those restrictions are going to be placed back again in a month or so. And now the total length of unfreedom is going to be longer. But as far as like undermining neoliberal ideology, I think what COVID is doing actually, it's almost like COVID is a precursor, a sort of like a taste of what's to come from climate change, unless we do dramatic changes to prevent climate change reaching its worst and to ameliorate climate change. In some ways, the COVID is an ecological disaster. You know, this sort of what they call zoonotic transfers of viruses. You know, they come about because of all sorts of ecological and economic impulses, pushing people into forests, mining into forests, bush hunting, all of these sorts of things. The climate change. Climate change has the effect of making animal populations move to new areas because they can no longer survive in the old areas, and that pushes people into contact with animals or human populations to animal populations that are not there before. And those are the conditions in which you'd expect more pandemics. But the structure of the pandemic of COVID is a little bit like the structure of climate change, more on a bigger scale, if you know what I mean. Partly because, you know, one thing, both of them show that we are actually completely interdependent. They really reveal how humans are interdependent, not just with other humans, but with other natural systems, with animals, other natural systems, etc. It also shows that they're both immediately planetary problems, right? So one of the things that we see with COVID at the moment is that I think 18 people died of COVID in the UK yesterday, which we would like not to happen. But because of vaccinations, those number of deaths have dropped off dramatically. In the global south, in South Africa, you know, tens of thousands of people are dying. The deaths are really, really, really high because vaccinations haven't reached there. But the problem is COVID is not a problem you can solve on a national basis, because the point is all of these unvaccinated populations where the virus is circulating, that's where variants from of the COVID virus get developed. They get developed through this unvaccinated populations, and eventually we're going to get variants which escape from our vaccine protections, and we're back to square one. It's a problem you have to solve at a global level, just as climate changes. You have to solve it at a global level. That means we have a big task in front of us. We have to build the institutions for global democratic coordination and planning, really. There's no way around it. We need global planning for scarce resources. And so that is the problem that neoliberalism can't handle. It's climate change. COVID is just a taste of what's to come unless we do something. Climate change is the big problem. And one of the things we see in the UK, one of the effects of the pandemic seems to have concretized the problem of climate change for younger people in particular. And now they see climate change as the absolute mission of the dominant problem of their lives, because they've had a taste of what a crisis which interrupts normal life looks like. And they know there's more to come, I think.
We are speaking with Keir Milburn, who wrote the Novara media opinion piece, Freedom Day Won't Set Us Free, Populist Masterstroke, More Like Unmitigated Disaster. You quote youth activist and writer Bella Lack, tweeting, "The first crisis is ecological, the second is medical. The coronavirus is a secondary symptomatic crisis. We are creating a vulnerable and fragile planet. And as we do so, we become even more vulnerable and fragile, too. Our war against nature is inevitably a war against ourselves." Now, again, here in the States, the idea that somehow the pandemic and climate change are related is rarely, if ever, discussed in our mainstream commercial or public media. And when it is, climate change's links to the pandemic that are reported, and the pandemic's links to climate change, for that matter, it's always qualified as uncertain, or the headline will be a question suggesting it is very much up to debate and opinion. How does not seeing that link between climate change and the pandemic affect the response to the pandemic, both on the state level and individually?
Yeah, it's a really good question again, Chuck. One way to think about this is, like in the US, I think the wearing of masks and so response to the pandemic is much more politicized in a sort of party political manner than it is in the UK. But we can understand that. We can understand the UK government's Freedom Day farrago. And we can understand, this sort of like right-wing refusal to wear masks, and then beyond that to sort of deny that COVID is dangerous, or that perhaps it doesn't even exist, or anything like this, or to deny that climate change is happening. Like, we've got to understand the relationship between this individualized sense of freedom and this impulse to towards what we could call denialism, really, basically the denial of reality. And the way to understand that is because people's experiences of this individualized freedom, they actually exist. When people probably do feel free. We've all driven down the motorway with the windows open, the air streaming in, and felt free, I'm sure, right? And so to be told that, like, actually your sense of that, this lived sense of freedom in a way is actually causing all of these problems for other people, for yourself, all around the world, and we need to think differently about that. That's an uncomfortable thought, right? And that sort of discomfort from having that lived sense of freedom made into a problem, I think that's what underlies this sort of denialism and perhaps all of the sort of culture war narratives and myths that circulate around that. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's how it impacts. Perhaps we have to think about this problem of denialism in a couple of different ways. That, like, there's sort of like a sincere denialism, if you want, right, where people just feel uncomfortable, and so they steer away from and sort of refuse certain ideas, which will discomfort them and problematize their freedom. Then you've got the more, what you might think of, the cynical denialism of people who are purposely trying to introduce distrust, who are purposely trying to gain political gain from this level of denialism. Like, the thing that's really on my mind at the moment is in Brazil, where you have one of these key denialists, Bolsonaro, who's this Trump-like figure, president of Brazil. He's going to lose the next election to Lula. There's no doubt about it. The gap between them is like 30 points. The election's not till next year. Now they're trying to rush through these huge amounts of laws and infrastructure building to basically destroy the Amazon. It's a very scary thing, because the Amazon is so big, it produces its own weather. It produces the rain that a rainforest needs. But if you reduce, once it shrinks to a certain size, the Amazon won't be able to produce that weather. Therefore, it will die off in dramatic fashion. It's going to reach a tipping point. We don't know how soon that tipping point is, and people are worried that tipping point could be met before Bolsonaro was thrown out of power next year. It's one to really keep an eye on, I think. It's really quite worrying.
How much do you think that understanding of freedom, whether it's a democratic freedom or the individualistic freedom, how much do you think that is the current political line of demarcation, not only in the UK, but globally? Are we drawing lines based on our understanding of freedom?
Do you know what? I think that's right. I think it is two versions of freedom. One version of freedom which has sort of held sway for a long time. So Annalene Dejin, when she says, looks at these two versions of freedom, she says this democratic freedom, that was along for a long time, and it was only after the sort of democratic revolutions of the 18th century, the US Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, we should add actually, to that, it was in reaction to that, the elites of the world at that point, they created this individualized conception of freedom as a protection, a way to protect their property from the poor. Basically, that's what they thought democracy would lead to. And so this individualized idea of freedom, we can, like, the best image of it is to think of a rich person with a big pile of gold who wants to build the walls around that gold to keep other people out, to protect their property. That's what the walls of individualized freedom are. We can think of it in that way. So that's one form of freedom. But I think, especially among younger people, last time we talked, we were talking about my book, Generation Left, which is all about that there may be a new generation emerging, which has sort of more common sensely, in which equality between races, equality between sexualities, etc., is much more common sense. I think that is emerging. As in the article I mentioned, the England football team who were playing in the European Championships recently, and there was a big scandal. They basically, the England football team had decided they were going to take the knee, to copy Colin Kaepernick's gesture, to take the knee in an anti-racist protest just for a few seconds before the kickoff of every match. And when they started doing that before the championship started, some England fans started booing. And there was a big scandal about it. This is outrageous booing. The Boris Johnson government, they said, it's fine to boo, right? And in fact, the booers are the good guys. And this England football team, these are the woke mob and all. You must know all of these horrendous terms. But when you think about it, it's just that England football team is made up of young working class kids. that is the common sense, that innate sense of equality is the common sense of that generation, and that automatically leads to this universalized democratic sense of freedom, which actually needs people to be broadly equal in order for that to have any sense, I think. So I think there are two senses of freedom battling for the future of society. And when we look at climate change, the future of human race depends on one of those forms of freedom, democratic freedom, winning that race over the next 10 or 20 years.
And you write that we can't just assume that we're freely choosing agents. Take the world of work, in which we surrender control of our activities to bosses who are driven by the inhuman logic of capital accumulation, like you were mentioning before. And you add the often obscured unfreedom. This often obscured unfreedom has been brought to the fore by the coronavirus pandemic, given the obvious limitations that work presents to our ability to decide on our exposure to the virus. And the 4-Day Work campaign tweeted, "Work is the greatest form of unfreedom we experience on a day-to-day basis. Let's reduce the extent to which it dominates our lives. Let's build a world where we work to live rather than live to work." Now, this is the idea that democracy stops at the workshop door, much like it is said that democracy stops at the schoolhouse door. Is the unfreedom of the workplace undemocratic? And are those who believe in the individualistic concept of freedom demanding more democracy, if not worker-run and owned businesses, as well as more power for students in school? Do those who believe in individual freedom want a world where we work to live rather than live to work?
Yeah, it's a really good connection to make. As far as I'm concerned, we need to complete the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, but we need to complete them for everybody and in every part of life. So that means democracy should reign in the economy, right? And that is one of the lessons that has to follow from these sorts of crises, such as COVID and the climate crisis, right? We have to have some level of democratic planning around the use of resources, some level of democratic control within firms, workers' co-ops, etc., or just to democratize the firm so that workers have more of a say. There's all sorts of steps you could go to that, and I think that is also one of the emerging common sense. Part of the emerging common sense politics of a sort of younger left generation. It's not as wide as sort of anti-racism and anti-homophobia, for instance, but you certainly see if you look at the 4-Day Week campaign, they do surveys, and young people are so much more pro the reduction of the working week and see that as freedom than older people. And in part, I think it's because working conditions and the kinds of jobs available to young people are basically worse than when their parents were at work. Okay, working on a factory floor is not is hard, grueling, destructive to your body, etc. But in the UK in the 1970s, people who worked on it, you had very strong unions. You had the amount of pay. The amount of the national income that went to pay was hugely more than it is now, where hugely more of the national income goes to profits rather than to wages. So I think that this experience of worse work in many ways among the young is sort of driving this idea that you don't find freedom through your work, you find freedom, through control over your life. And so the more control you have over your work, the more freer it is. But perhaps you also need to reduce the amount of time dedicated to work so that we have more free time beyond that.
Is individualistic freedom then denialism for any responsibility or contribution or complicity in any of the world's problems, including climate change, racial exploitation and violence, inequality and poverty? Is individualistic freedom simply an unwillingness to take responsibility for your actions? Because that, again, counters right-wing ideas of people just aren't responsible enough.
Yeah, yes, it's a really good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, one way to think about what is this emerging democratic sort of sense of freedom, which is just a completion of a much longer tradition of freedom, 2,500-year-old sense or tradition of freedom, and in a way it is just about us taking responsibility for the impacts of our actions, basically. But that's, in some ways, it's a tricky argument to make, because of course there's an idea that there is a sense of neoliberal responsibilization, right, in which you're made to feel responsible for things that you have no control over. So if you're unemployed because of the state of the economy, you're made to feel that it's your responsibility that you're unemployed. Or perhaps you have an anxiety disorder and it's like it's your responsibility to do it. Well, of course, it can't just be that people's fecklessness goes up during economic crisis. It is, we are not responsible for all of these things that we're made to feel responsible for. We're actually not responsible for them. And then, all of the things that our actions actually do result in are hidden from us, right? By things such as the market. And the market is a place to sort of distance us from the consequences of our actions, if you know what I mean. You do something, we buy a good here, but we don't see, the unfreedom that's gone on to both produce that, the carbon that's been produced and put into the atmosphere to move those goods around society. So in one way, we want the reduction on this unfair sense of individualized freedom, and then the expansion of the realm of like collective responsibility, so we can identify what we really have control over, and therefore work out a way to negotiate those responsibilities in a democratic manner, I think.
And another contradiction I just want to point out. Author and climate change activist, past guest on our show, Bill McKibben, recently wrote an opinion piece and tweeted about it, saying that climate change is now producing more refugees than war. So what explains why those who do oppose migration and immigration, why are they not adamantly anti-climate change?
Yeah, yes. So that that sense of denialism linked to a sort of right-wing politics, which is also anti-migrant, etc. You can see how it all fits together, really, because, of course, it's easier to deny that these people who are migrating, who are trying to cross the Mediterranean to get to Europe from Africa, etc. Something like 10,000 people have died trying to cross the Mediterranean over the last 5 years. You can deny that their rights to freedom, right? That's easier to do that by demonizing those people than to accept that our own actions might actually be driving migration. You're right. As climate change gets more severe, parts of the earth, or larger parts of the earth, are going to become very, very difficult to inhabit for humankind. And so we're already seeing sort of migration being driven by climate change. Many people have pointed to the Syrian civil war as something which was provoked by a spike in food prices caused by the effects of climate change, the first climate change war. That drove huge populations of Syrian people to leave the country to try to find a better life elsewhere. And so we can either there's two futures facing us. One of them is this horrible negative sort of feedback loop in which, we have climate change increases, therefore we have more wars and more displacement of populations, which means countries citizens in countries such as the UK and US might respond in a sort of, in an anti-migrant thing, and that's a negative feedback loop. Or you can have a positive feedback loop where we try to deal with climate change in a sort of democratic manner. We start to increase our capacities to act in the world and to recognize our connectedness with other people. And that means that dealing with climate change can lead us, in fact, to a much better world than we had pre-climate change. We've got sort of two futures in front of us, one of them linked to a very individualized sense of freedom, one linked to a more democratic, collectivized sense of freedom. I think those are the futures in front of us. One of them seems very unattractive to me, and one of them seems quite attractive indeed.
One more question for you, Keir. We have had the honor of speaking with Keir Milburn, who wrote the Novara Media opinion piece, Freedom Day Won't Set Us Free, Populist Masterstroke, More Like Unmitigated Disaster. Keir is the author of Generation Left, which we discussed with him back in 2019. You can find that interview at thisishell.com when searching on his last name, Milburn, Milburn. Keir is co-host of Novara Media's #ACFM podcast, and you can follow Keir on Twitter at Keir Milburn. Milburn. One last question for you, and as we do with all of our guests, our final question is the question from hell. The question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience is going to hate your response. You write, the separation of belief and action when it comes to contributing to climate change can be made sense of through looking at the institutions and infrastructures that organize our lives. Built around an individualistic logic of personal choice, most operate as though the climate crisis isn't happening. The stock market, for example, assumes that trillions of pounds worth of carbon reserves will be extracted and burnt. Yet doing so will destroy human civilization. With this kind of logic coming to structure our everyday lives, it produces a sense of unreality when it comes to the most pressing political problems of our time. This is how we are trained to adopt the individualistic concept of freedom. So is personal choice destroying human civilization? Is the real threat to human civilization climate change, the pandemic, or personal choice?
That is a tricky question. But and of course, the thing we do with tricky questions is we pick it apart. And so we have to think about what we mean by personal choice. And so like our personal choices are structured by the infrastructures that underlie us and the institutions we interact to. Let's take it in a really obvious way. It's much better for the environment if I take a train than if I take a plane, right? It's much better for the environment. And I will, but of course, the decision whether that my personal choice about whether to take a train or to take a plane, well, it depends whether the train line is there, whether that train runs quickly enough, whether it's cheaper or at the same price as a plane ticket. Crazily, it's much cheaper for me to fly from the UK to Barcelona. Not actually allowed at the moment because of COVID, but when we're allowed again, it's much cheaper for me to fly from Leeds in England over into Barcelona in Spain than to take the train. And the train could take something like I think it takes like 36 hours. So that's the choice. One of them, the infrastructure is not there. So the choice is really inconvenient and quite expensive. The other one, the infrastructure is there. It's cheap, it's convenient, but it will contribute to the end of the world. It's a personal choice is not something which just depends on us as a person. It depends on the infrastructure, the institutions, the society, and the logic that structures all of those institutions together. So it may be personal choice, but the only way out of that is to create real choice by removing the financial and economic constraints on our actions, by removing the infrastructures that steer our lives to act as though we don't think climate change has happened, even though we can see it outside our windows at this very moment.
Keir, thank you so much for being back on the show. I want to make certain that it isn't 2 years between your next visit, and we'll be bugging you in the very near future to have you back on the show. It's always great speaking with you, sir.
I really enjoyed that, Chuck. Hopefully speak soon.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.